The drone came in quiet, which was the first wrong thing. I was 3 verses into the second movement of the Mourning Rite when the station's outer perimeter alert chimed once and went silent. That is not how a threat arrives. A threat announces itself in cascades, thermal bloom, targeting chirp, the high whine of a weapon's coil being charged. What chimed once and went quiet was something small, something slow, something that had cut its thrust well outside the marker buoys and drifted the rest of the way in. Something that wanted to be seen before it was heard. I held the last syllable of the second verse until it was finished, because the rite does not stop for small vessels, and then I stepped to the console. One hull, roughly 3 meters in length, Earth registry markings, no weapon signature, cargo hold sealed, contents unlisted, no transponder identification beyond the registry number and a single-line classification tag, accord response, ecclesiastical comms. I did not know what that meant. I stood at the console for a long time reading it, and the words did not become clearer. The Veth Solon had been gone for 61 days. Let me tell you what you need to understand before the rest of this makes sense. The Veth Communion is not a military organization. We are not a government, a trade consortium, or a mutual defense alliance. We are the keepers of a ritual tradition that predates most of the political structures currently dividing this sector of the galaxy, and our stations are not armed. The memorial station Veth Kel exists for one purpose, to hold the frequency open so that the dead can be sung back across the dark. When a communion vessel is lost, when the hull goes cold and the crew with it, and there is nothing to recover, the nearest station broadcasts the Mourning Rite on the chapel band, and holds the channel open for the duration of the full rite, which is 9 days from first verse to last. The chapel band is not an emergency frequency. It is not a distress frequency. It carries no military traffic, no commercial routing, no navigational data. It is the oldest continuously maintained transmission band in the Communion's operational archive, handed down from the founders and adjusted every generation only slightly. The same frequency, give or take a handful of kilohertz, for the better part of 4 centuries. I had begun the rite 3 days before the drone appeared. 6 more days remained. The drone drifted to 200 meters off the station's docking collar and held position there, running on station-keeping thrusters only, transmitting nothing beyond its registry classification, waiting to be invited in or turned away, in the precise manner of something that understood the etiquette of a grief space. I had received supply couriers at this station for 11 years, and none of them had ever approached in that particular way, the way of something that has read the situation and chosen its speed accordingly. I keyed the hailing channel, vessel at the outer marker, this station is in Mourning Rite, identify and state your approach purpose. The response came in Communion Standard, which was already strange, because an Earth registry ought to have defaulted to one of the trade language bridges. The translation was clean, formal, slightly archaic in the way of documents rather than people. Responding Vessel Courier DX Harlan, Earth Ecclesiastical Response Corps, acting under Accord 7, Article 3 of the Interspecies Ecclesiastical Comms Treaty, Cycle Notation 183 Veth. Your morning broadcast was received at Earth's Deepwatch Intercept Station at 4:12 local relay time, Cycle -4. Accord 7, Article 3 requires that any Mourning Rite transmitted on the chapel band intercept frequencies listed in Annex C of the treaty shall receive a formal acknowledgement, and where geographically feasible, a physical witness response within 72 hours of receipt. Response time from receipt to current position, 61 hours, 44 minutes. Requesting docking permission to discharge the Accord obligation. I read the message twice, then a third time. Then I sat down, which is not a thing I do during a rite. The Mourning Rite has protocols for interruptions and emergencies, a series of suspension clauses that allow the chaplain operator to pause the transmission without breaking the sacred count of days, and I engaged the suspension clause without thinking about it because I needed to sit down, and I needed both hands on the console. The chapel band had 2 listeners. It had always, apparently, had 2 listeners, and one of them had been Earth. I should explain the Veth Solon, because the drone matters more if you understand what we had lost, and you will not understand what was lost if I give you only the numbers. She was not a military vessel. She was a colony tender, 412 souls aboard, bound for the 3rd settlement in the Veth Communion's slow, methodical expansion into the deep drift. We do not move fast. We do not build where we have not looked, and we look carefully, and we look long. The Solon had been 4 years in preparation. The hull surveys, the agricultural cargo packing, the crew selection process that takes longer than the hull surveys because the hull can be corrected after launch and the crew selection cannot. 4 years of preparation, and then she had gone dark 11 weeks into her transit. The last signal from her was a navigational check-in on the standard relay, unremarkable in every particular fuel consumption within norms, crew health logged as satisfactory, the drift vectors holding. After that, nothing. No distress call, no anomaly report, no last transmission of any kind. We searched for 31 days. We found nothing. Not wreckage, not debris, not the faint chemical trace a hull leaves when it depressurizes hard and fast. Whatever had taken the Solon had taken her completely, and the deep drift had closed over the absence as if she had never been. 412. The number is a complete sentence. I will tell you some of the individuals later, because the number alone is the wrong unit for what we lost. The Council of Voices authorized the rite on the 32nd day. And so I stood at the transmitter on Veth Kel, and I began to sing. The Mourning Rite is ancient, as I have said. It is conducted in a voice register we call the deep carry because it is designed to travel, the frequency chosen by the founders not for any spiritual reason they ever committed to writing, but because it carried furthest across the band of interference that wraps the drift like a slow weather. The founders were practical people. They built a ritual, and then they tuned it to physics. The chapel band was chosen because it worked. What none of them had known, what none of us had known, in 4 centuries of broadcasting the rite, was that the band worked in an additional direction. I looked at the treaty reference in the drone's message. Accord 7, Article 3. Cycle Notation 183 Veth. The cycle notation told me it had been signed during the Veth Communion's 183rd administrative cycle, which placed it approximately 183 years ago. I had not been alive 183 years ago. Neither had anyone currently serving in any administrative role within the Communion. The treaty had been signed by people we called Founders Generation 3, the last of the long-memory administrators who had personally met humans, who had negotiated in rooms where both species were present simultaneously, who had believed in the fragile and complicated idea of a relationship between 2 kinds of people who had enough in common to be interesting and enough difference to be cautious. Founders Generation 3 had been dead for 140 years. And yet someone in that generation had sat across a table from Earth's representatives and signed a document that said, in effect, we will maintain a frequency for our mourning and you will listen for it, and when you hear it, you will answer. I have thought about that room many times since the drone arrived. What conversation led to that clause? Whether the humans proposed it or the Communion did. Whether it was a small addition to a larger treaty, some diplomatic courtesy appended to a mutual survey agreement, the kind of thing that gets signed because it costs nothing and filing it feels like goodwill, something for the record that nobody expects to activate, or whether someone on one side of the table had thought carefully about what it would mean for a mourning song to be heard by strangers and had decided the answer was worth having. I engaged the suspension clause for a full hour. I made myself read as much of Accord 7 as I could access from the station's treaty archive, which is not complete but which had enough of Articles 1 through 4 cached from some long-ago document transfer to tell me the scope of what had been signed. It was not a short document. It was not a document written by people who thought they were writing a formality. Then I released the suspension clause and I went back to the transmitter, and I continued the second movement. And when the second movement was complete and the suspension period formally closed, I went back to the console and I keyed the response. Courier DX Harlan, you are cleared to dock at Collar 2. This station is in active right. Please observe morning protocols on docking, silence on approach, no recording equipment active beyond your accord documentation, no crew movement beyond the designated witness area. Confirm. Confirmed. DX Harlan out. The drone came in slowly, the way all of it had been slow, that measured, patient approach that was nothing like a threat. I watched it on the console screen as it closed the gap to the collar, as the docking arm extended, as the locks engaged with the soft, definitive clunk I knew from every supply tender and medical courier that had ever come to Veth Communion. Then the hatch opened, and Harlan Das walked out. He was a human male, which I had expected. He was older than I had imagined for no reason I could articulate, grayed at the temples, deep-set lines around the eyes, the bearing of someone who had done physical work for most of his life and intended to continue until he could not. He wore a uniform I did not recognize. Not military, not civil service exactly, something that occupied a space between the two, dark cloth, simple insignia, a small embroidered symbol at the collar that I would later learn was the Earth Ecclesiastical Response Corps designation. He carried a case in each hand, both of them dark, both of them heavy-looking, neither of them anything other than what they appeared to be. He stopped at the base of the docking ramp. He did not come further into the station. He set both cases down at his feet, straightened, and looked at me across the 10 meters of corridor that separated us. He said nothing. He did not wave. He did not offer his hands in any of the greeting postures I had studied in the old diplomatic correspondence. He stood, and he waited, and his expression was the thing I had not expected. Not relief at having arrived on time, not the careful professional neutrality of a functionary completing a task, not the slightly anxious formality of someone in an unfamiliar cultural space trying very hard to get the customs correct. He looked like someone who had stood in grief spaces before, many of them over many years. Someone who had learned, through long repetition, not to fill the silence with himself. I crossed the corridor. I stopped 2 meters from him, because that is the communion's customs distance during a rite, close enough to speak at conversational volume, far enough that the space is not collapsed by proximity. I said in communion standard, "You came from Earth." He said yes. 61 hours. 61 hours, 44 minutes. He said it without apology in his voice, the way a person states a fact they cannot change and choose not to pretend otherwise. "I'm sorry I wasn't faster." I said the accord requires a witness response. You are the witness. Yes. You know what we lost. It was not a question. He would have read the registry. The accord documentation would have attached whatever we had broadcast, the Rite carries, in its formal opening sequence, the name of the vessel and the count of souls aboard, because the dead deserve to be named at the beginning of the ceremony for them, not saved for the nomming movement. He said the Solon, 412. Something about hearing it said by someone who was not of the communion, who had no obligation to name them, who did not know any of them, who had come across 61 hours of relay distance carrying 2 heavy cases, and who had taken the time to memorize the number before he walked off the ramp. Something about that sat in my chest in a way I did not have immediate vocabulary for. A weight settling, and the weight settling was not heavier than what was already there. It was, somehow, more evenly distributed. Yes, I said. I have the accord materials in the cases, he said. When you're ready, I don't want to rush the rite. I had not said anything about the rite being rushed, but he had understood, from the way I was standing or the way I had phrased things or from the years of assignments behind him, That timing was something I was managing. "What are the materials?" I asked. He crouched and opened the first case. He did it without ceremony, efficiently, the way a craftsman opens his tools, not to impress, not to delay, just to show. Inside, in precisely fitted compartments, a package of Veth compound preservation medium, the kind used in memorial sealing, in a quantity sufficient for a full station application. A set of memorial alloy plaques, blank, machined to a standard that I recognized from old communion archive photographs. The same alloy, or close to it, that we had used for memorial walls before a supply disruption 4 generations ago had forced a substitution. The modern communion memorial walls use a substitute alloy that does the work, but does not carry the same surface quality. These plaques carried the original surface quality. I did not ask where he had sourced them. The cases suggested he had expected to need them. He opened the second case. A portable beacon unit, compact, durable, sealed against hard vacuum. A power cell rated for 300 years of continuous operation. A manual for the beacon's operation in 3 language bridges, with communion standard first. The beacon is calibrated to broadcast on the Solan's last confirmed navigational frequency, he said. When you have her last coordinates or the best estimate, it can be placed and left. It transmits her name and her crew count and the date of the rite. If anyone comes through that sector in the next 3 centuries, they'll know she was there. He paused. If you want it, the Accord doesn't require you to use any of the supplementary materials. Article 3, subsection 9, the materials are offered, not prescribed. I said, who wrote this accord? He looked up from the case. I don't know the names personally. I can look them up if you want. The Corps has records going back to the original signing session. You want them? No, I said. I want to understand the intention. I can tell you the operational intention as I was trained on it, he said. The idea was that no morning broadcast should go unacknowledged, that there's a specific kind of weight that falls on a community when grief goes into the air and comes back silence. The Accord was built to prevent that weight from landing. He closed the second case. He did not stand back up immediately. He stayed crouched, one hand resting on the lid of the case, looking at the corridor floor for a moment in the manner of someone choosing words carefully rather than reaching for the nearest ones. The founders who signed it, your founders and ours, apparently had a conversation about what it means to broadcast grief into empty space, whether it's worse to hear silence back or whether silence is at least honest. Earth's position, as I was trained on it, was that silence is never preferable when showing up is physically possible. He stood. Whether that's right, I can't tell you. It's what we came with. I went back to the chapel comms chamber, and I finished the second movement of the rite. Harlan Das stood in the designated witness area, which is a half-circle of deck space just inside the chamber's main hatch, marked in the communion's oldest floor inlay pattern. The inlay is a design so old that most of the communion stations have repaved over it during modernization cycles, but Veth Communion is one of the original 7 stations, and the floors have not been touched in the relevant sections. The witness area exists because the rite has always had witnesses. Members of the crew, council representatives, family when they could attend from far enough away in time. The floor design was old enough that it predated the requirement of a witness from within the communion itself. I had never thought about that before. Someone had designed that space for anyone who came to stand in it. Harlan Das stood the way I would learn was the way he always stood in these spaces, not rigid, not frozen, but settled. As though his body had, over 41 assignments, learned to take up only the space it was given and let the space do the rest of the work. When the second movement ended, I stepped out of the transmitter alcove. He met my eyes and he nodded once, which is a gesture I recognized from the old diplomatic correspondence as the communion-acknowledged form of arrival recognition. The nod had apparently traveled in both directions across the founder's table. We had each kept half of it. The third movement tomorrow morning, I said. I'll be here, he said. You're staying for the rite. Article 3 specifies that the witness response is for the full duration of the rite unless the hosting party formally releases the responding party. He said it without bureaucratic flatness, the way someone states a commitment they intend to keep regardless of whether the contract requires it. You haven't released me. I might not release you for 6 more days, I said. I know, he said. I brought supplies for 9. I had not expected that. I showed it, some change in my face that I did not manage quickly enough, some expression of surprise that a careful person would have noticed, and Harlan Das was a careful person. The accord was written by people who understood that a mourning rite is not a brief ceremony, he said. I don't know everything they understood, but they understood that. I fed him that evening from the station stores. We ate in the small common room off the main corridor, the two of us, across a table that had last hosted a full meal for a council inspection team and a supply tender crew, 8 people, a working meal, food consumed with approximately half the attention it deserved. Now it was 2 people, and the attention was different. I asked him how many assignments he had completed. He said 41. Not all communion. The Earth Ecclesiastical Response Corps covered 17 species whose mourning practices had some overlap with the Accord network, which was larger and older than I had understood from the document fragment in the archive. 17 species, I said. The core accord is the communion and Earth, he said, but there are supplementary agreements, some of them older than the communion Earth one. The network has been growing, slowly. Different teams handle different traditions. He looked at his plate. Some of the traditions I work in, I understand well by now. Some of them I still make mistakes in. He picked up his utensil and set it down again in the manner of someone sorting a thought. The first assignment I had, I was 23 and I had trained for 6 weeks and I thought 6 weeks was enough. I didn't know what I was doing. I showed up with the materials and I stood in the wrong place, and at one point I said something I had been told was comforting in that tradition, and it wasn't, not the way I said it. The widow of the ship's captain, she was very patient with me about it afterward, more patient than I deserved. What did she say? She said that presence was different from words, and that I had confused them, that I had been so occupied with finding the right words that I had stopped being present. He picked up the utensil again, and this time used it. I've thought about that distinction every assignment since. What do you say now, when you arrive? Whatever's accurate, he said. What the Accord documentation tells me about the vessel and the crew, the name, the count, what I know of the mission. Sometimes I say nothing for a while and let the space establish itself. He paused. The Vorith, the 34th assignment, their morning practice is complete silence. 9 days of it. The Accord has no specific clause for silence-based practices, so there was a question of whether it applied. I said it applied because the Accord is built to prevent grief from going unheard, and their silence was a form of transmission too. I went. I sat with a Vorith elder for 4 days in silence. He looked across the table. What a human field chaplain does in 4 days of silence is learns what silence sounds like from the inside. And afterward, on the 3rd day, she touched the back of my hand, very briefly, then withdrew. He set down the utensil. I didn't know at the time whether it was meaningful. I learned afterward that it's the Vorith gesture for "you are here," which is also their phrase for "I know," depending on context. I said perhaps the same thing. He looked at me. Yes, he said, perhaps. The 3rd movement of the rite takes place at first light cycle, when Veth Communion's rotation brings it to the facing position relative to the drift's nearest illumination source. This is not sunrise in any organic sense. We orbit no planet. The light source is a distant star rather than a close one, and the light that reaches the station is cool and indirect, filtered through the drift's particulate layer. But the Communion's tradition was built on a world, long ago, and it retained the first light framing, because the founders believed that grief should begin a new day rather than end an old one. There is something in that I have always found correct in a way I could not fully articulate until Harlan Das put words to something adjacent to it. Grief held entirely inward becomes something else. The dawn framing is the tradition's way of saying, extend it outward again, every morning, until the full count of days is complete. I stood at the transmitter, and I broadcast the third movement into the dark, on the chapel band frequency, on the frequency that Earth had been listening to for 183 years without my knowledge, and without any of our knowledge. And I thought about what it meant to have been heard all that time by someone who had simply been waiting to be needed. The third movement is the verse of names. 412 names, each one spoken full in the naming order of the communion's registry, first the captain, then the officers, then the specialists, then the crew in order of seniority, and last the civilians. Children named last, if there are children aboard, because the naming order is the reverse of the order of operational responsibility, and children carry no operational responsibility for what happens to a vessel, and so they are named last and they are named longest, the long form of each name, the full registry designation, nothing abbreviated. There were 9 children aboard the Veth Communion. Harlan Das stood in the witness area for the full naming movement. I could see him from the transmitter alcove. The station's chapel comms chamber has no separation between the transmitter and the witness floor, because the founders believed a mourning rite conducted in isolation from its witnesses is a private grief, not a communal one, and the rite is communal by design and by necessity. The naming took 3 hours. The names of the 9 children took 40 minutes of those 3 hours, because each name is long, and because the deep carry register adds duration to certain vowels, and because I do not rush that movement. I have never rushed it. I will not rush it for speed or for the comfort of witnesses who find long ceremonies difficult. If a witness finds 3 hours difficult, the appropriate response is to have reflected, before attending, on whether a 3-hour ceremony is something they are prepared for. Harlan Das did not find 3 hours difficult. He stood the way he stood. At the 9th child's name, a name with a long third syllable and a falling close, a name designed in the old register to carry as far as the frequency could push it, I heard something from the witness area. Not a vocalization of any ceremony I had taught him. Not an attempt to participate. Just the sound a person makes when something lands on them from the outside, and they do not try to prevent it from landing. I finished the verse. I stepped out of the alcove. He was standing the same way he had been standing. He did not look embarrassed, and he did not look as though he expected me to acknowledge what I had heard. His face had the expression of someone who has done this work for a long time and has learned that a moment of being moved is not a failure of professionalism, and that performing steadiness in such a moment would be the actual failure. I said nothing about it, neither did he. On the 4th day, I asked him about the cases, and he helped me open them, and we began the preliminary work for the memorial plaques. There are 412 plaques to make, 1 per soul. The work takes time. The work is meant to take time because each plaque requires a name in full, a vessel designation, a date of loss, and a secondary mark that in communion tradition is drawn from the individual's service record, not a rank, but a characteristic, the thing they were known for. A quality, a habit, a reputation held among their colleagues. The chaplain operator of a memorial station is supposed to know the crew of the vessel being mourned. And I had spent 31 days of the search learning the Solon's 412, before I accepted that there was nothing left to find, and the rite needed to begin. Harlan Das held the tooling when I needed a second hand, and he learned the communion's inscription order by watching me complete the first 7 plaques, and after that he asked if he could handle the primary labeling while I focused on the secondary marks, which require a different kind of attention. I said yes, and he did it correctly, neatly, with attention to the depth of each character, because a shallow mark weathers and a weathered mark becomes illegible, and an illegible mark defeats the purpose of the plaque entirely. He was not fast, he was not slow. He worked at the pace the work required. In my 11 years at Veth Communion, I had never watched a person from outside the communion figure that pace out in 4 days. Most visitors to this station, supply tenders, council couriers, maintenance teams, work at the pace they brought with them. Harlan Das calibrated. On the 5th day, during the break between the morning movement and the afternoon transmission, he asked about the Solon's mission. Not the disaster, the mission. What they had been going to build, where the colony was to be placed. I told him, the third settlement in the Deep Drift expansion, a world with a long name in the Communion's geographical register, and a short informal name that the survey team had given it because the formal name was cumbersome in daily use. Kel Soth, the bright stone, because from orbit its mineral surface catches the local star's light in a way that looks, at the right angle and the right distance, as though the planet itself is lit from below. The survey team had named it that, and the name had stuck in the planning documents, which is unusual for informal names. "Is the mission continuing?" he asked. "Not immediately. The council will decide. It has not yet been discussed formally." I paused. "It is not appropriate to discuss it during the rite. The rite is for the lost. What comes after is for after." He nodded. "That seems right. Does Earth's tradition separate them that way? The grief time and the planning time?" He thought about it for a moment in the way he thought about things, without rushing toward an answer, the way someone does when they have learned that the first answer is usually the approximate one, and the accurate one requires a pause. "Not formally," he said. "But in practice, most people don't plan well while they're still in the grief. The planning and the grief push against each other and neither comes out right. I've seen communities that try to collapse them together. They move to planning very fast because planning feels like action and action feels like not suffering." He set down the plaque he was holding. "It usually doesn't work as well as they hope. The planning is brittle because it's built on a foundation that hasn't settled yet." "It shortens the grief but doesn't complete it," I said. "Yes, and then the incomplete grief shows up later in the planning, in the decisions that look like practical decisions but are actually something else, something about the loss that wasn't finished." He picked the plaque back up. "The 9 days, whoever designed that was thinking clearly. The founders said, the dead need 9 days to cross the dark," I said. "I have always understood that to be a way of saying, the living need 9 days to let them go." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, that's exactly what it is." On the 6th day he told me about the 40th assignment. A species called the Vorith, different detail than what I had heard over the dinner table, specifically the conversation afterward with the Corps supervisor, who had formally questioned whether a silent mourning practice qualified under the Accord's terms. The Accord was explicit about transmitted frequencies. Silence, technically, was not a transmission. Harlan Das had argued that the Accord's purpose, preventing grief from going unheard, was not satisfied by a technical reading that excluded silence mourning, that the Vorith were in grief, that their silence was the form their grief took, that showing up for a transmitted frequency and declining to show up for silence was a distinction the Accord's writers had not intended and would not have endorsed if asked. The supervisor had pushed back. The document was the document. Harlan Das had said, the document was written by people, and those people had a purpose, and the purpose was not honored by the document being used to exclude the people it was meant to serve. The supervisor had logged it as a disputed interpretation and elevated it for review, which meant the assignment had no official sanction while he was on it. He had gone anyway. I said, "You went on your own authority." "I went because the Vorith elder was in grief, and there was a 61-hour transit between her and the nearest response team." He said it the same way he said everything, with the particular flatness of someone who has made a decision he does not regret and does not feel the need to defend. The review came back 6 months later. They ruled my interpretation correct and updated the operational guidance. The 40th is now cited in the training documentation as an example of correct judgment. He paused, as an example of going anyway. On the 7th day, a message arrived from the Council of Voices. It had been forwarded through the Communion's relay network, marked for my attention at Veth Communion, from the third-ranking council voice, Keth Salavar, who holds the Memorial Protocol's portfolio and who had personally authorized the rite. The message was formally addressed and formally worded, which meant it was official and on the record, and it said, "We have become aware that a vessel from Earth has docked at Veth Communion under an Accord reference we have been unable to locate in our current archive. Please advise on the nature of the Accord obligation, whether the Communion consented to the arrangement, and whether the visit poses any operational concern." I composed my reply carefully. I told Keth Salavar about Accord 7, Article 3, Cycle Notation 183 Veth. I told her about the Chapel Band Intercept, about the Earth Ecclesiastical Response Corps, about the memorial materials and the beacon and the plaques being made in the station's workroom. I told her about Harlan Das standing in the witness area of the Chapel Comms chamber for 7 days. I told her, the Accord was signed by people we call Founders Generation 3. Those people are dead. The Accord they signed is not. I would suggest that when the rite is concluded and the Council has its proper time to address the matter, the Communion's archive team be directed to locate the full document, because I have been reading the sections available on the station's cache, and there is more in it than Article 3. There are clauses covering situations I did not know we had arrangements for. Keth Salavar replied the following morning, a single line, "Understood, archive review will be arranged, working group authorized. Continue the rite." It was the most efficient response I had ever received from a council voice on a novel diplomatic matter. I told Harlan Das about it over the morning meal. He said, "The archive review will take a while. Some of the supplementary agreements are in older document formats, but the core articles are straightforward." "You know the full document," I said. "I know the core operational sections, Articles 3 through 11. The diplomatic history sections I'm less familiar with." He thought for a moment. "Article 8 covers the memorial archive exchange. Each party is supposed to maintain a record of the other's lost vessels and transmit an updated copy every 50 years. I don't know if either side has kept up with that. The review will clarify." "A record of our lost vessels," I said, "kept by Earth, or maintained as best as Earth could, given what we had access to." He paused. "Some of it will be incomplete. The transmission cycles were infrequent and the information pathways were limited, but the intention was that neither side should not know about the other's losses." I thought about that. An archive somewhere, not on any Communion station, not in any space the Communion's archivists had visited in 100 years, that held the names of our dead. "We'll request a copy in the review," I said. "Yes," he said, "you should." On the 8th day, I told him about Veth Rama. She was the Solon's chief agricultural specialist on her second colony voyage. Her first had been the second Communion settlement, 17 years earlier, a smaller mission, an easier world, a good beginning. She had been the one who read the soil preparation data for that settlement in a way her colleagues described as below the instrument level. Not in contradiction of the instruments, but ahead of them. She understood what the data was moving toward before it arrived at the conclusion, the way a skilled navigator understands a drift vector not just as a number, but as a direction with momentum. She had volunteered for the Solon's mission the day the crew applications opened. She had not been required to. She was senior enough to have taken a station posting for the rest of her career. She wanted to go to Kel Soth. She had reviewed the survey data, and she had wanted to see the bright stone from the ground. Harlan Das asked what her secondary mark was. I said, "Listens below the instrument level." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good mark." "She was going to be essential to the settlement," I said. "The kind of essential that you only understand fully in retrospect, When the thing goes right and you look back at all the points where it could have gone wrong, and you see the person who had seen those points coming. I paused. The work we did on her plaque on the 7th day. You did her primary labeling. I remember the name, he said. I didn't know the rest until now. I wanted you to know, I said. I don't want them to be 412 to you. I want some of them to be people. He looked at me directly. He said, they're not 412, but thank you for telling me. How many of them have become people to you, across 41 assignments? He thought about it. More than I expected when I started, he said, which is more than I could name. He looked at the plaque he was working on, a crewman from the Solon's navigation section, name noted, secondary mark not yet applied. The names are part of it. Working with the names, it does something different than just reading them on a list. That is why the plaques are made by hand, I said. The founders understood that. Our founders too, he said. Or they wouldn't have put the materials in Article 3, subsection 9. The 9th day. The final movement of the Mourning Rite is not transmitted on the chapel band. This is sometimes misunderstood by people outside the communion who have read accounts of the rite but not studied its full structure. The 9th day movement is conducted on the station's interior channel only, broadcast within the hull, received only by those physically present. It is the movement of closing. The rite has been outward-facing for 8 days. The signal going into the dark, the names going into the drift, the grief extended toward wherever the lost have gone. The 9th day folds back. It says, we have held the channel open. We have kept vigil. We now close the transmission, and what continues beyond this point continues in us, not on the frequency. I conducted it in the chapel comms chamber. Harlan Das stood in the witness area. There is a formal release in the 9th day movement. A moment where the chaplain operator acknowledges the witnesses present and, if the tradition of the station permits, invites them to speak. Not a eulogy, the rite is not a eulogy, which is a form of speech about the dead for the benefit of the living, with the dead as subject and the living as audience. What the 9th day invitation asks for is something different, a statement of witness, what you came with, what you are taking away. It can be a long statement or a short one or silence, and silence is acceptable, and the invitation is genuine on both sides. I had never, in 11 years and 11 rites, given the invitation to someone outside the communion. I had never had occasion to. I looked at Harlan Das in the witness area where he had stood for 9 days, and I gave the invitation. He stood the way he always stood. He looked at me. There was a pause in which I could hear the station systems, the low cycling of the atmospheric processors, the faint hum of the transmitter in standby, the particular silence of a hull in open space that is different from the silence of any enclosed space on a surface. Then he spoke. He said, I don't know any of the 412. I know what the record said, the vessel, the mission, the count. I know the names now because we made the plaques. I know that Veth Rama red soil below the instrument level. I know the captain's name because it was first and the last child's name because it was last, and the navigation crewman's name because I labeled his plaque on the 8th day and thought about what it means to navigate the drift for a living. He paused. What I can offer is that they were heard. The rite went out on the frequency and it was heard, and something was sent back, not a rescue, not a recovery, not what you would ask for if you were drawing up a list of what you needed. Something heard the transmission and said, we are here. That is what the accord was built to make possible. I hope it was worth something. I said it was worth something. He nodded once. I closed the transmission. We placed the beacon 3 days after the rite concluded. I had obtained the best coordinate estimate the Communion's navigational archive could provide, the last confirmed position, the drift vectors, the most probable loss zone. Harlan Das and I took the station's small transit shuttle to the edge of the drift, out past the search boundary where the 31-day search had stopped, out to where the deep drift closes over things and does not return them. The transit took 4 hours. We did not talk much. I watched the drift through the shuttle's viewport, the particulate layer, the slow wheeling of the distant illumination source, the particular quality of emptiness that is different from the emptiness of clear space. Clear space has defined absence. The drift has layered absence. It is a different thing to look at. We placed the beacon at the outer edge of the search boundary. Harlan Das ran the anchoring sequence while I held the position, and then the power cell engaged and the broadcast began. Veth Solon, 412, the date of loss, the date of the right. Transmitting on the Solon's last confirmed navigational frequency, going out at the beacon's rated range, beginning its 300-year cycle. I held position until the beacon's signal registered on the shuttle's receiver. Clean transmission. Strong. The way the founders built the chapel band to carry, further than you expected, longer than the circumstances required, into the dark whether anyone was listening or not. "She's transmitting," Harlan Das said. "Yes," I said. On the return transit, I asked him something I had been holding since the second day. "The Accord has been active for 183 years, I said. The Communion has conducted mourning rites on the chapel band for all of that time, more in fact, since the band predates the Accord. In those 183 years, how many times has Earth sent a response team?" He looked at me in a way that told me he had expected the question, and had been waiting to see if I would ask it. "8 times, he said, "including this one." I absorbed that. 8 transmissions in 183 years, the Communion's mourning rites broadcast into the dark, and 8 times the signal had reached Earth's Deepwatch station at the right angle, with the right strength, through whatever the drift did to it in transit, and 8 times someone at that station had logged the receipt and dispatched a response. "The others," I said, "the earlier 7. 4 were logged as completed responses in the core archive. 2 were logged as arrival too late. The station had gone dark before the response team reached it, for reasons that weren't recorded in the archive notes I have access to." He paused. "1 was a special case. The station was in right when the response team arrived, but there was a secondary situation, damage to the station, structural. The response team helped with the repairs in addition to the Accord obligation. The Communion operator at that station filed a formal gratitude record with the Corps. It's the only one in the archive." "And the 8th, I said, "this one." "This one," he said. "Why so few?" I said. "In 183 years, the Communion has conducted more than 8 mourning rites." "Yes," he said. "The Accord Annex C lists the specific frequency bands that Earth monitors. The chapel band has always been on the list, but the drift interference is significant in some sectors. The signal doesn't always reach the Deepwatch station with enough clarity to register as an Accord event. The monitoring technology has improved over time. The last 40 years have had better reception than the previous 100. He looked at the viewport. "There have also been years, long ones, when the Corps was not adequately funded and the Deepwatch monitoring staff was reduced. In those years, the Accord did not function as it was designed to. The Corps archive has notes about that. It's not a record anyone is proud of." I thought about that for the rest of the transit. 8 times in 183 years. And for the years in between, our grief going into the dark and reaching the Deepwatch station at the wrong angle or the wrong strength, or arriving in a year when the monitoring staff was too small to catch it. The Accord built by founders who understood what it meant for grief to go unheard, held imperfectly over the long distance of 183 years, catching what it could. Still catching, still there when it was needed. When we docked at Veth Communion and when Harlan Das had packed the empty cases into the drone's cargo hold, and when the docking arm had retracted and the collar locks were cycling, he stood at the base of the ramp the same way he had stood when he first arrived. The customs distance, the same posture, the same patience. "The Accord releases me when the rite is concluded and the beacon is placed," he said. "I'll file the response documentation when I'm back at the relay station. The Communion will receive a formal copy." I know, I said. I have read Article 3 with some attention. Something changed in his expression, very small. The way his expressions had always been small and precisely calibrated to what they were saying. Something that in the right light might have been called a smile, though the word seems too uncomplicated for the specific thing his face did. I assumed you had, he said. The Council's working group will review the full document, I said. Keth Solivar is thorough. It will be read carefully. Good, he said. Some of the clauses have been dormant for a long time. It would be worth knowing which ones still apply and which ones need updating. He paused. The Corps is available for the update process if the Communion wants a counterpart consultation. It's not required, but it's available. I'll include it in my recommendation to the Council, I said. Will you come back? I asked then. The second time I had asked it, the same question I had asked before he went up the ramp the day after the rite concluded, and he had said, if you call, I'll come back. I was not sure why I was asking again. Perhaps to hear it confirmed by the same person who had stood in the witness area for 9 days in the station corridor before the drone took him away. He met my eyes. If there's a right, he said, that's the accord. I know what the accord says. Yes, he said, you do. He picked up the last empty case and went up the ramp, and the courier drone undocked with the same measured patience it had arrived with, and drifted out to the minimum thruster distance, and then lit its drive and was gone. I want to tell you what I have told the Council of Voices, which is now a formal report entered into the archive, and which I will tell you here as well because a report in an archive is a different thing from the same words spoken directly, and both kinds of telling are necessary. The Veth Solon is still gone. 412 are still dead. We did not recover the vessel, we did not learn what took her, and the bright stone of Kel Soth still waits for a settlement that has not arrived. The beacon is transmitting from the edge of the search boundary and will transmit for 300 years, and if any vessel comes through that sector in that time, communion or otherwise, from any of the 17 species in the Accord network or any of the many who are not, they will know she was there. They will know her name and her count and the dates. That is something. It is not enough, and it is something. What I have told the Council is this. When we built the chapel band, we built it to carry grief into the dark because grief needs to be extended outward toward wherever the lost have gone. We did not build it to be heard by strangers. We broadcast on it because the physics were right and the tradition required it, and we did not consider whether anyone else might be listening because it had not occurred to us to consider it. Someone else was listening. They had been listening for 183 years, since a table of founders made a decision that, at the time, probably felt like a diplomatic courtesy, a thing you sign because it costs nothing. Maybe that is all it was at the signing. I cannot know the intention from inside the document. What I know is the result. The result is a man who carried 2 heavy cases across 61 hours of transit space and stood in the Communion's witness area for 9 days and made plaque labels with appropriate depth and asked to know the names of the dead as people rather than as a count. The result is a beacon transmitting the Solon's name at the edge of the drift. The result is a line filed in a core archive on a planet I have never seen. Accord obligation discharged. Veth Communion, 9 days, 412, rite completed. The result is that the grief did not go unheard. I have been a chapel operator for 27 years. I have conducted 11 mourning rites. I have never, in those 11 rites, had a witness from outside the communion stand in the witness area for a full 9 days. I did not know it was something that could be offered. I did not know we had signed a document that made it possible, or that Earth had been holding the other end of that document for 183 years, waiting for the signal to come through clearly. The rite is for the dead. That is what we say, and it is true in the sense that the dead are why we begin. But Harlan Das said something on the second evening that I have thought about every day since, that the Accord was built for the living, that the specific weight of grief going unheard is a weight that falls on the living, not the dead, that the dead are past weight, the living carry it forward. I have turned that distinction over many times, whether it diminishes the rite, whether saying the ceremony serves the living somehow makes it less of a ceremony for the dead. I have concluded that it does not. The dead are named. The dead are remembered. The deep carrier goes into the dark with their names and carries as far as the frequency will push it. None of that is lessened by also being a thing the living need. The rite is for the dead, which is why we begin, and it is for the living, which is why we end. We did not ask Earth to hear us. Earth was listening anyway, because a table of founders decided that grief going into the dark should have someone at the other end of it, and built a document to make that possible, and a corps to carry out the obligation, and a man who packs supplies for 9 days and goes. I have recommended to the Council of Voices that the accord be formally reviewed, ratified in its current form pending any amendments the review identifies, and transferred from the supplementary historical record, where it has been sitting for 140 years, since the last administrator who knew about it was alive, to the primary reference archive where it belongs. I have also recommended that Harlan Das be entered in the Communion's witness record, the old registry that names all who have stood in Communion witness areas since the founding. There are roughly 6,000 names in that registry. He would be the first who was not of the Communion. Keth Solivar approved both recommendations without amendment. The archive transfer is complete. The witness registry edition is pending the formal confirmation ceremony, which will be conducted at the next full council session. The colony mission to Kel Soth has been authorized again. The council voted in the 3rd week after the rite concluded. A new vessel is being fitted. The agricultural team has been reassembled, not the same team, because the same team is gone, but a new one, built with the same care as the last. They have acknowledged, collectively and formally, that there is no replacing Veth or Rama, who read below the instrument level, and they are moving forward anyway, which is the most Communion thing anyone has said about an impossible task in my memory. I think about Harlan Das sometimes, now that the station is quiet again. I think about what 41 assignments makes of a person, the specific calibration it builds, the specific kind of knowing that comes from standing in 41 different grief spaces for 41 different communities and learning, each time, the particular shape of each tradition's silence. I think the thing that held between us for 9 days was not comfort and was not ceremony exactly, though it was shaped by ceremony. It was something like recognition. The recognition that grief is a transmission, and that a transmission without a receiver is only half of what it is designed to be. The founders understood that. Both sets of them. Whatever room they sat in, whatever conversation led to Accord 7, Article 3, they understood that grief broadcasted into empty space and answered by silence is a different weight from grief broadcasted and met with a presence at the other end of the frequency. I stood at the transmitter for 9 days, and I sent the Mourning Rite into the deep drift, on the chapel band, on the frequency that Earth had been listening to since before I was born. And at the other end of that frequency, 183 years old and still operational, there was a listener. The listener answered. The dead are still gone. The living carry the weight forward. Somewhere at the edge of the search boundary, the beacon is transmitting. And Earth, because of a document signed by founders none of us alive had met, because of a corps built to discharge the document's obligations, because of one man who goes anyway when the signal comes through, Earth did not look away. That is the account. I have filed it as such with the Council, and I am filing it here, in the secondary record, where the things too long for the official record, and too important to leave only in the official record are kept. Sevet Oron, Chapel Operator, Vereth Kel, Day 31 after the rite's conclusion.